Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about favorite second books in series. I got this inspiration because I just recently finished a book two in a trilogy, which I absolutely loved, and I'll be talking about it later in the video. But also because I tend to be somebody who loves a book one in a series. I love being introduced to a new world, a new cast of characters, a new setup. But if I'm going to commit to a series, I think it's very useful to know if what the author set up in book one is really well developed in book two. So, for that reason, I feel like book two in a series is a good test for me personally. And I just want to mention some favorites here today. But before getting into my personal favorites, of course, this will be spoiler free. But also, I want to mention some other books that are fan favorites that might not be my personal favorites, but are definitely worth mentioning. So, the first of these is Dead House Gates by Stephen Erickson, book two in Malazan Book of the Fallen. And so I did read this 10-book series. I think that the popular opinion when reading Malazan Book of the Fallen is not to enjoy Gardens of the Moon as much as Book 2 Dead House Gates. Gardens of the Moon has that immediate res, drop you into the middle of everything and figure it out type of setup. And I feel like people might have a bit of a struggle with that and might enjoy the pacing in book two in contrast to that. Now, for me personally, I enjoyed book one more, and I think I just really enjoyed the very unusual atmosphere and wild magic, quirky characters. I just had a great time with it. And when I picked up book two, I was totally ignorant of this series, and I didn't know that we would be on a new continent with so many different characters. And so it was more of an adjustment for me, I think, than even book one. But I know that's the unpopular opinion. I feel like most people, again, tend to prefer book two. And yes, book two does have a reputation for having a spectacular ending. And it does have reverberations throughout the rest of the series. And I will say that even though I had some adjustments with book two, I did enjoy the ending or appreciate the ending. And months later, after finishing this book, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I think that says something. The second honorable mention is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, book two in the Stormlight Archive. And so I have the very unpopular opinion of preferring Way of Kings, book one, but book two, Words of Radiance, is a fan favorite. Now, maybe the reason it wasn't a favorite for me is I was lightly spoiled by things that happened at the end of that book, but you do get some interesting things that develop from book one. So I think I could see why it's a fan favorite. And then the third honorable mention is Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. So this book is the second book in the Red Rising trilogy. Now, for me, I think that it was a timing thing because I reread The Fellowship of the Ring right before picking up Golden Sun, and I think it was just jarring for me to adjust from Middle Earth and this beautiful story that's more slow paced to a very fast action packed space opera. However, I could see how people would love Golden Sun. I feel like there are many incredible plot twists that happen in that book. And I do think that Pierce Brown, his writing style improves so dramatically from book to book. And you could even see that quite a bit from Red Rising, the first book in that trilogy, to Golden Sun. Now, on to my favorites list. The first one I'm going to mention is Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. This is book two in the Farseer trilogy. And so this trilogy follows a character named Fitz Chivalry, and he's a royal bastard. And once his birth is known about, his father, who is heir to the kingdom of Buckkeep Palace, he ends up being shamed into resigning his title as heir and ends up exiling himself. And this leaves Fitz in a position where, in order to be useful to the throne, he is made into an assassin's apprentice. And so book one follows Fitz from a very young age. It's very much a coming of age story. And I feel like we're getting to know this character and the conflicts of the circumstances he's born into. Book two, however, takes things that happen in book one and it further develops. And then there are so many dramatic moments that unfold, but it never feels abrupt. It feels like everything just gradually unfolds and unfolds. And breaks you open. Plus, you're introduced to one of the best animal companions in all of fantasy in Royal Assassins, so it definitely makes a place on the list. Next one I'm going to mention is Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch, book 2 in the Gentleman Bastard series. And honestly, I've only read the first 2 books in this series so far. I haven't read the third one yet. I think this might be an unpopular opinion, maybe, but I think I preferred book 2, Red Seas Under Red Skies, or I at least enjoyed it just as much. When you hear about this series, it is about the gentleman bastards, and they are thieves. The saying is, thieves prosper, the rich remember. So they steal from the rich and they go on all these heists, and it feels kind of like Mission Impossible in fantasy. You can't take it too seriously, at least the plot part of it, even though there are some dramatic things that happen along the way. But as much as you hear about this series, I think one thing you commonly hear about the gentleman bastards is about the friendship, especially the friendship between Locke and Jean. And so I think that it shows pretty well in book 1. However, I think book 2 is where you really feel that friendship deepen. Plus, there's a whole nautical fantasy element in book 2. And I personally loved the settings in book 2 because you have this island that feels kind of like Las Vegas on an island. It was very over the top, but it shows you how far the rich are willing to go to exploit the poor, especially during peace times. I think with a lot of these over the top opulent settings, I think, again, if you love nautical fantasy and you love friendships in fantasy, and if you love very interesting settings, then I think you might enjoy, and good humor, by the way, you might enjoy book 2, Red Seas Under Red Skies. The next one to mention is book 2 in the Dark Tower series, which is called The Drawing of the Three. I feel like this is one of those titles that throws people off in book Jeopardy with Alan because it has 3 in the title, but it's book number 2 in a series. But this book is so good. So this series, the Dark Tower series, in book 1, we're following Roland. We're introduced to that character who's the primary character of this whole series, chasing a man in black across the desert. And his whole goal is to make it to this dark tower. And while it's a great introduction book, book 1, The Gunslinger, book 2 is amazing. It's not even my favorite book in the series, but it's still incredible because we get introduced to some time travel elements, some portal fantasy really opens up, urban fantasy elements. You see how genre defying this series is in book 2, and you get introduced to some of the best characters ever, including different characters from different timelines. And I think it's just brilliant the way that Stephen King is able to give you these characters from different timelines, from different decades, and make them seem so realistic. And at the same time, they interact with each other in a realistic way. I don't know how he does it, but we get introduced to Eddie Dean, a heroin addict from the 80s, Odetta Holmes, who has dissociative identity disorder, if I have that correctly, and she's from the 60s. She's a civil rights activist. And another character that will be familiar to you if you read book 1. I love The Drawing of the Three. Not even my favorite book in the series, but just a fabulous sequel. Okay, next one to mention is Before They Are Hanged, book 2 in the First Law trilogy. Now, this trilogy is often labeled as grimdark, and most people who read it always say, wow, it's not as dark as I thought it would be. Now, it's definitely not up there as the darkest fantasy, but I think that the way the world is set up is quite dark, and it's hard to talk about the plot of this trilogy, in my opinion, unless you read the entire trilogy, because it's more like one big story broken up into 3 parts, kind of like Lord of the Rings. But the first book, The Blade itself, I thought was enjoyable because of the writing style, humor, and character work, but I wasn't sure I was totally invested in the story at the time, and I might have not continued had I not heard such great things about each book after that. And sure enough, Before They Are Hanged, the second book won me over. It wasn't until I read that book that I realized I could read a book just for the characters alone. And that's how I felt with that book. It's not that there aren't things that happen in that book. It's just that for me, it didn't even matter anymore. I just loved the character combinations and the conversations they had and the humor. It made me a First Law fan, so it definitely deserves a place on this list. And then the next book I'm going to go ahead and mention is Enemy of God, book 2 in the Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. So, is this historical fiction or historical fantasy? I think you really have to read this series to find out. I think it's kind of ambiguous, honestly, but it is an Arthurian retelling. And if you're into Arthurian retellings, especially ones that demystify the Arthur legend, you are in for a treat. If you love Merlin and you want to see a dark Merlin interpretation, then you should check this out as well. I quite enjoyed the humor and the world, and especially as this is in first person narration from the character Derval's perspective. He's a bannerman for Arthur. And in the first book, there is a lot of setup, a lot of exposition. We do get some amazing action towards the end, and we get introduced to Galahad, who ends up being Derval's good friend. But in book two, I feel like is where all the tragedy and betrayal and drama happens. And there's a Tristan and Isolde retelling, which is, by the way, I love Tristan and Isolde, so I loved that. And I think that that was the book that won me over with Derval, the person who's telling the story. He became a favorite character of mine in that book. But I was also just so impressed with the emotional range of this particular trilogy, especially in that second book, because there are some really heartbreaking moments and there are funny moments and there are shocking moments, but there's just such a range. So, book two, Enemy of God, was my favorite, though I love this entire trilogy. It's one of my favorite trilogies of all time. Now I'm going to mention the book that inspired this video, and that's going to be the one I just recently finished, which is The Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. Yes, Joe Abercrombie makes the list twice in this video. This is the second book in the Age of Madness trilogy, which takes place much later after the First Law trilogy. And my goodness, this book is so good. I really loved book one, A Little Hatred, and I thought it would be difficult to top that because I enjoyed it so much. I think this book might have been a hair better. I can't really say anything because it's so spoilery, but we're dealing with the industrial age, the dawning of the industrial age, and all about progress and efficiency and machinery, and of course, how that leads into weaponry, but also war and revolution, rebellion, conspiracy. And it's just brilliant the way that the characters come to life and the way that female characters are represented. There is one particular female character in this book that is up there now as one of my favorite female characters of all time. I just lived for her chapters, but I also loved all the other chapters and perspectives too. So this book was just brilliant and it has to make the list. And I'm sorry I can't say more detail right now because I'm so fresh off reading it and it's really difficult to talk about without spoiling things. And even character mentions might be a little spoilery for those who are just getting into First Law. But my goodness, if you get into Abercrombie, if you loved the original trilogy, so well worth reading on. I feel like this trilogy, Age of Madness, is just perfection so far. So thoroughly entertaining, so funny, so shocking too. And the last one I'm going to mention is The Warrior Prophet, Book 2 in the Prince of Nothing trilogy by R. Scott Baker. So this trilogy deals with an impending apocalypse or second apocalypse and a holy war. And in book 1, you're really getting that setup and getting introduced to the characters you're going to follow in this trilogy. But book 2 has some of the most heartbreaking, tragic moments and betrayals that I've ever read in fantasy. And I think the character work and the psychology of the characters is unparalleled. The way that they behave in dramatic moments as well as in quieter moments was just incredible to witness as you read on in the series. And I think that the settings also added a lot of richness. So I think that this particular trilogy is great for fans of books that deal with heavy philosophical themes, including religious zealotry and questions of free will, manipulation, lack of agency. And I think that it was so well executed in the second book. It is some of the darkest fantasy I've ever read, some of the coolest magic I've ever read in fantasy as well. So this one is one that will forever be a favorite for me. R. Scott Baker's The Prince of Nothing trilogy, The Warrior Prophet. And that is my list. I know that there are a couple I haven't read that I hear a lot about, particularly the second book in the Sun Eater series I hear a lot about, and the second book in the Dandelion series. I haven't read those series, but please feel free to mention below any that I didn't mention that you love. And feel free to comment on any of the ones I mentioned. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.